The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban neighborhood. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns and modest homes, each one painted in soft pastel colors that gave the area a sense of calm and order. It was the kind of place where people waved to their neighbors while walking their dogs or exchanged pleasantries over white picket fences. But beneath this picturesque surface, there was an undercurrent of tension, a simmering unease that few dared to acknowledge. Daniel Carter stood in his kitchen, humming softly as he stirred a pot of spaghetti sauce. His wife, Lisa, sat at the dining table nearby, flipping through a magazine. Their two children, Mia and Ethan, played quietly on the living room rug, building towers out of colorful blocks. For Daniel, this moment felt like a dream come true. After years of hard work and sacrifice, he had finally been able to provide his family with the life they deserved. A beautiful home, a safe neighborhood, and the promise of stability. But even as he watched his kids laugh and play, a small part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. They had only moved into the house a few weeks ago, and while most of their new neighbors seemed friendly enough, there were a handful who hadn't exactly rolled out the welcome mat. Some would glance at them sideways when they passed on the sidewalk, their smiles tight and forced. Others avoided eye contact altogether, pretending not to notice when Daniel said hello. At first, he chalked it up to shyness or discomfort around newcomers. But as time went on, it became harder to ignore the subtle signs. The way certain doors would close just a little too quickly when he walked by, or how some conversations would abruptly stop whenever he approached. Lisa noticed it too, though. She rarely brought it up. She knew how much this house meant to Daniel, how proud he was to have built a life for their family despite all the challenges they'd faced. Still, there were moments when her protective instincts kicked in, urging her to say something. "Maybe we should talk about it," she suggested once, but Daniel brushed her off with a dismissive wave. "It's nothing," he assured her. "Just give it time. Things will get better." But tonight, things weren't getting better. Not even close. As Daniel turned down the heat on the stove and began setting plates on the table, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Glancing toward the window, he froze. Hanging from the large oak tree in their front yard was a noose. Its coarse rope swung lazily in the evening breeze, casting eerie shadows against the trunk. For a moment, Daniel thought he might be imagining. It's some trick of the fading light playing games with his mind. But no, it was real. Very real. "Lisa," he called out, his voice low and steady. She looked up from her magazine, frowning at the urgency in his tone. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for her to join him at the window. When she saw the noose, her hand flew to her mouth, muffling a gasp. "Oh my God," she whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Who would do such a thing?" Before Daniel could respond, they heard laughter drifting up from the sidewalk. Peering through the curtains, they spotted 3 men standing near the edge of their property. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with sandy blonde hair, was laughing loudly, pointing at the tree as if it were the punchline to some cruel joke. The other 2 snickered along, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "That's Kyle Brooks," Lisa murmured, recognizing him from previous encounters. He lived a few houses down and had made no secret of his disdain for the Carters since they moved in. On more than one occasion, he'd muttered under his breath as he walked past their driveway, making sure they heard every word. His friends, Jason and Matt, were always close behind, nodding in agreement like loyal followers. "They're doing this on purpose," Daniel said, his jaw tightening. "They want us to see it." Lisa reached out and touched his arm, her fingers trembling slightly. "We need to call the police," she insisted. "This isn't okay. We can't let them get away with this." For a moment, Daniel considered arguing. Part of him wanted to march outside and confront Kyle and his gang head-on, to demand answers and make them take down the noose themselves. But he knew better. Violence wouldn't solve anything. It would only escalate the situation. And besides, what good would it do? These were the same kinds of people he'd spent his entire life trying to avoid. Ignorant, hateful individuals who thrived on fear and intimidation. So instead, he nodded grimly and picked up the phone. As he dialed 911, Lisa kept watch at the window, her heart pounding in her chest. Outside, Kyle and his friend seemed oblivious to the chaos they had caused. They lounged casually on the curb, passing a beer bottle between them and laughing, as though they didn't have a care in the world. Every so often, Kyle would glance toward the house, a smug grin spreading across his face. When the dispatcher answered, Daniel explained the situation as calmly as he could, careful not to let his emotions get the better of him. "There's a noose hanging in our front yard," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "And there are 3 men outside who seem to be responsible. I think they're trying to intimidate us," the dispatcher promised to send officers immediately, but Daniel could hear the skepticism in her tone. To her, it probably sounded like a prank, a harmless bit of mischief carried out by bored teenagers. But Daniel knew better. This wasn't a prank. It was a threat, a deliberate attempt to remind him and his family of their place in a world that still saw them as outsiders. By the time the police arrived nearly 40 minutes later, Kyle and his friends had disappeared. All that remained was the noose, still swaying gently in the breeze. 2 officers stepped out of their patrol car, their expressions unreadable as they surveyed the scene. One of them, a middle-aged man with graying hair, approached the house, tipping his hat politely as Daniel opened the door. "Evening, sir," he said, glancing briefly at the tree before turning his attention back to Daniel. "Mind telling me what happened here?" Daniel recounted the events of the evening, doing his best to keep his tone neutral. He described the noose, the laughter, and the men he'd seen outside. But as he spoke, he could tell the officer wasn't taking him seriously. "You said you recognized one of them?" the officer asked, scribbling notes onto a clipboard. "Yes," Daniel replied. "His name is Kyle Brooks. He lives a few houses down." The officer nodded absently, then glanced at his partner, who was examining the noose. "Looks like someone's idea of a joke," he remarked, chuckling lightly. "Kids these days, always looking for attention." "It's not a joke," Daniel shot back, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "This is hate. Pure and simple." The officer raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. Instead, he promised to file a report and advised Daniel to keep an eye out for any further disturbances. Then without another word, he climbed back into the patrol car and drove off. As the sound of the engine faded into the distance, Daniel turned to Lisa, his hands clenched into fists. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and resolute. "Not by a long shot." The house was quiet now, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Daniel and Lisa sat in their living room, the weight of the evening pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. The children were finally asleep, their soft breathing drifting in from the next room. But Daniel couldn't relax. His mind raced with thoughts of the noose, Kyle's smug grin, and the dismissive attitude of the police officers. He felt trapped, cornered not just by the events of the night, but by years of memories he had tried so hard to bury. Lisa watched him carefully, her brow furrowed with concern. She could see the storm brewing behind his eyes, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched as if he were holding back words too dangerous to speak. Finally, she broke the silence. "Daniel," she said softly, "you need to talk about this." He looked up at her, startled, as though he'd forgotten she was there. For a moment he hesitated, staring at the floor as if searching for the right words. Then, with a deep sigh, he began to speak. "There are things you don't know about me," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Things I've never told anyone, not even you." Lisa frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He took a slow, steadying breath before continuing. "Before we met, before I became who I am today, I was involved in something. Something big." She tilted her head, curiosity mixing with unease. "What kind of something?" "It started when I was working at a research facility," he explained. "It was supposed to be cutting-edge stuff, biotechnology designed to push human limits. They were experimenting with ways to enhance physical abilities, speed healing, that sort of thing." Lisa's eyes widened. "Wait, you mean like superhuman abilities?" He nodded grimly. "Exactly. At first it sounded exciting, groundbreaking, but then they started running tests on volunteers, including me. Her hand flew to her mouth. You volunteered? Why would you do that? I wanted to prove myself, he said simply. I thought it would give me an edge, a chance to stand out in a world where people like me often get overlooked. And honestly, he paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. I guess I wanted to feel powerful for once. Invincible. Lisa didn't say anything, letting him gather his thoughts. After a moment, he continued. The experiments worked, at least partially. My strength increased, my reflexes got faster. I healed quicker than anyone thought possible. But there were side effects too, things they hadn't anticipated. Like what? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mood swings, anger issues. Sometimes I felt like I couldn't control my own body. He shook his head, remembering the long night spent pacing his apartment, trying to calm the storm raging inside him. The project was shut down after a few months because of ethical concerns. Too risky, they said. But by then, it was already done. I couldn't undo what had been done to me. Lisa stared at him, stunned. This was a side of Daniel she had never seen before. A part of him he had kept hidden all these years. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. I didn't want you to look at me differently, he confessed. And I didn't want to scare you. Once I left the facility, I promised myself I'd leave that life behind. I focused on building a career, starting a family, being normal. But you're not normal, are you? She asked gently, not accusingly but matter-of-factly. No, he admitted. But I've worked hard to keep it under control, to make sure I don't lose myself again. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The room seemed smaller somehow, the air thick with unspoken fears and questions. Finally, Lisa reached out and placed a hand on his arm. I'm glad you told me, she said. But what does this have to do with tonight? Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. Because of what happened out there, with the noose with Kyle, I'm worried I won't be able to hold back anymore. If they keep pushing, if they keep provoking me. You think you'll snap? She finished for him. He nodded. And if that happens, I don't know what I'm capable of. Lisa squeezed his arm, reassuring feeling. Conflicted, torn, protect family, yet knowing violence wasn't answer either. We'll figure this out, reassured softly, together. Despite reassurance, tension lingered, unresolved question hanging air. How far? Willing go defend loved ones, line crossed, point return. Night wore Daniel lay bed, staring ceiling, unable sleep. Mind replaying confrontation earlier evening, every detail vivid, fresh nightmare. Kyle's laughter echoing ears, taunting reminder prejudices, lurking beneath surface civilized society pretended didn't exist. Meanwhile, elsewhere, neighborhood Kyle friends gathered, basement, cluttered, empty beer bottles, overflowing ashtrays, smell stale smoke, lingering air. Jason sprawled couch, scrolling phone. Matt pacing restlessly, occasionally kicking stray trash can, lying floor, seemingly restless energy, pent needing release. You really think wise messing guy? Matt muttered, breaking silence, abrupt movement, startling others, momentarily snapping attention. Present conversation. Kyle glanced, shrugged nonchalantly, dismissing concern. Mere triviality. Insignificant compared, thrill, power, dominance derived, instilling fear. Uncertainty prey. Relax, dude, scoffed arrogantly. What gonna do? Call cops again? Didn't exactly rushing rescue last time. Jason snickered, agreement chiming. Yeah, besides, look at him, probably scared stiff anyway. Bet doesn't even guts stand. Unbeknownst trio underestimated opponent vastly, assuming typical reaction-based stereotypes. Failed recognize depth, complexity, individual facing, moreover. Oblivious consequences. Actions potentially unleashing forces beyond comprehension. Control back Carter residence. Lisa eventually drifted uneasy slumber, leaving Daniel alone. Wrestled demons. Plaguing conscious, subconscious alike, hours passed, motionless darkness enveloped surroundings, amplifying intensity, emotions swirling within. Frustration, anger, helplessness intertwined, knot chest threatening overwhelm, consume entirety. Being finally Dawn crept horizon, bringing promise new day, albeit uncertain, perilous one. Decision needed, made soon. Whether confront issue directly, indirectly, allowing simmer boil explosive proportions. Alternatively, seek alternative solutions. Diffusing tension, averting disaster looming horizon. As sunlight streamed through windows illuminating corners, previously shrouded shadow clarity emerged amidst chaos. Realization struck undeniable truth underlying circumstances. Regardless, choice ultimately selected. Critical, ensure safety, well-being, family paramount priority. Regardless, personal cost, sacrifice entailed achieving desired outcome. Thus, stage set unfolding drama, destinies intertwined irrevocably, altered course events, transpired subsequent days. Weeks follow. Precedents established, lessons learned, legacies forged. Defining legacy, generations inherit aftermath. Turbulent chapter history. Written lives. Ordinary, extraordinary individuals alike. Navigating treacherous waters. Prejudice. Hatred. Courage, resilience, shining, guiding light path, redemption. Reconciliation. Elusive yet attainable, distant future awaits, patiently unfolding embrace, awaiting embrace. Inevitable conclusion, destined etch annals, eternity. The next morning brought no relief. If anything, the tension in the neighborhood felt heavier, like a storm cloud hovering just above their heads, ready to burst at any moment. Daniel had barely slept, tossing and turning as thoughts of Kyle and his gang swirled endlessly in his mind. When he finally dragged himself out of bed, the exhaustion was written all over his face. Lisa noticed immediately but didn't say anything. She knew better than to push him when he was like this. As they prepared breakfast for the kids, Mia and Ethan chattered excitedly about their plans for the day. They were too young to fully understand what was happening, blissfully unaware of the ugliness lurking outside their home. For that, Daniel was grateful. He wanted nothing more than to shield them from the hatred and ignorance that seemed determined to invade their lives. But deep down he knew it wasn't possible, not completely. Sooner or later they would have to face it too. After dropping the kids off at school, Daniel returned home to find Lisa standing in the driveway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. At first, he thought she was upset about something unrelated, a missed appointment or a forgotten errand. But then he saw the look on her face. It was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and fear. "What's wrong?" he asked, already dreading the answer. She pointed toward their silver SUV parked near the curb. As Daniel approached, his stomach sank. The entire driver's side of the car was covered in bright red spray paint, the words glaring up at him in jagged letters. Racial slurs, crude and hateful, marred the once pristine surface. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure the message was loud and clear. Daniel clenched his fists, fighting to keep his emotions in check. "This has Kyle written all over it," he muttered through gritted teeth. Lisa nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Before Daniel could respond, they heard laughter coming from down the street. Turning, they spotted Kyle and his friends, Jason and Matt, walking casually toward their own house. Kyle held an empty spray can in one hand, twirling it carelessly as if it were a trophy. His smirk widened when he noticed Daniel staring at him. "Hey, neighbor," Kyle called out, his tone dripping with mockery. "Looks like you've got some redecorating to do." Daniel took a step forward, his body rigid with fury. "You think this is funny?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Kyle shrugged, feigning innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe someone else did it. You should really lock your car, though. Can't be too careful these days." His friend snickered behind him, egging him on. Jason leaned against a nearby lamppost, clearly enjoying the spectacle, while Matt kicked at a pebble on the ground, trying to appear nonchalant despite the nervous energy radiating off him. "You're testing me," Daniel said, his voice rising, slightly. "Pushing me to see how far I'll go." Kyle raised an eyebrow, pretending to consider the idea. "If I were pushing you, you'd know it," he replied, his grin widening. "But hey, maybe you're tougher than you look. Prove me wrong." For a moment, Daniel froze, caught between the urge to lash out and the knowledge that doing so would only play into Kyle's hands. He glanced back at Lisa, who stood a few feet away, her expression pleading with him to stay calm. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to take a step back. "This isn't over," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the fire burning inside him. "Mark my words." Kyle laughed, clearly unimpressed. "Whatever you say, tough guy. Just remember you started this." With that, he turned and walked away, his friends following close behind. As they disappeared around the corner, Daniel exhaled slowly, releasing some of the tension that had been building in his chest. But the anger remained, simmering just beneath the surface. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat alone in the garage, staring at the damaged SUV. He had tried scrubbing off the paint earlier, but it was useless. The words had seeped into the metal, leaving permanent scars. It was symbolic, in a way, of everything he had endured throughout his life. No matter how hard he worked, how much he achieved, there were always reminders of the prejudice and hatred waiting to pull him down. Lisa joined him after a while, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him without saying a word, sitting beside him on an old wooden stool. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the situation pressing down on them both. Finally, Lisa spoke. "What are we going to do?" she asked softly. "We can't keep living like this." "I know," Daniel replied, sipping his coffee. "But I don't see any other options. The police won't help. They made that clear last night. And if I confront Kyle directly, things will only get worse. There has to be another way," Lisa insisted. "Something we haven't thought of yet." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe. But until then, I need to focus on keeping us safe. On making sure nothing happens to you or the kids." Lisa reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "And what about you? Who's going to protect you?" He didn't answer right away, instead staring into the distance as if searching for answers. After a moment, he shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe I don't need protecting anymore." Her eyes widened, alarmed by the implication. "Daniel, please don't do anything reckless. We need you here. With us." "I'm not planning anything," he assured her, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his words. "But if they keep pushing, if they cross that line, they won't," Lisa interrupted firmly. "Because we won't let them. We'll find a way to stop this before it goes too far." Though she sounded confident, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. Kyle and his gang had underestimated him, assuming he was just another victim waiting to be preyed upon. What they didn't realize was that Daniel wasn't the same man he used to be. The experiments, the years of suppressing his abilities, it had all led to this moment. And now, with every taunt, every act of vandalism, they were awakening something they couldn't possibly comprehend. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel stood on the porch, watching the shadows lengthen across the yard. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Somewhere in the distance he heard laughter, Kyle's laughter, and felt the familiar surge of anger bubbling to the surface. But this time he didn't fight it. Instead, he let it simmer, feeding the fire within him. Because deep down, he knew one thing for certain. Kyle and his friends had no idea who they were dealing with, and soon they would regret ever provoking him. The days that followed were tense. Kyle and his gang didn't let up. If anything, their harassment grew bolder. They seemed emboldened by Daniel's lack of retaliation, convinced that he was too scared or powerless to fight back. What they failed to understand was that Daniel wasn't ignoring them out of fear. He was waiting. Waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to show them exactly who they were dealing with. One evening, just as the sun began to set, Kyle decided it was time to escalate things further. He rallied Jason and Matt, urging them to join him for what he called a little fun. Armed with trash can lids, bats, and loud voices, the trio marched down the street toward Daniel's house. Their plan was simple: make enough noise to disrupt the peace, taunt Daniel into losing his temper, and humiliate him in front of the entire neighborhood. As they approached the house, Kyle led the charge, shouting insults and banging on the trash. cans with reckless abandon. The sound echoed through the otherwise quiet neighborhood, drawing curious glances from windows nearby. Some residents peeked out cautiously, while others quickly pulled their curtains shut, unwilling to get involved. It was clear that no one wanted to cross Kyle, not even those who disapproved of his actions. Inside the house, Daniel heard the commotion immediately. He had been sitting in the living room, scrolling through emails on his laptop, when the first clang of metal against metal reached his ears. At first, he tried to ignore it, hoping they would grow bored and leave. But as the noise grew louder and more aggressive, he realized there was no avoiding what was coming next. Lisa appeared in the doorway, her face pale with worry. "They're here again," she said softly, though it wasn't really necessary. The racket outside spoke for itself. Daniel closed his laptop and stood up, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Stay inside," he told her firmly. "No matter what happens, don't come out." She hesitated, torn between obeying his request and staying close to support him. "Be careful," she whispered finally, stepping aside as he walked past her. When Daniel stepped onto the porch, the sight before him was both infuriating and pitiful. Kyle and his friends were jumping around like overgrown children, shouting obscenities and throwing garbage onto the lawn. Matt held a baseball bat, swinging it clumsily at invisible targets, while Jason banged 2 trash can lids together like cymbals. Kyle, however, was the ringleader, pointing directly at Daniel with a sneer plastered across his face. "Hey, neighbor," Kyle shouted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "How's it feel to live in a place where nobody wants you? Maybe you should pack your bags and find somewhere else to go." His friends erupted into laughter, egging him on. For a moment, Daniel simply stood there, watching them with an unreadable expression. There was no anger in his eyes, no trace of fear, just a cold, calculating calm that sent a shiver down Kyle's spine, though he didn't dare admit it. "You've made your point," Daniel said finally, his voice steady and clear. "Now, it's my turn." Kyle faltered, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. "What did you say?" he snapped, trying to regain control of the situation. Instead of answering, Daniel descended the porch steps and walked slowly toward them. His movements were smooth, almost casual, but there was an undeniable power behind each step. Matt noticed it first, instinctively taking a step backward as Daniel drew closer. Jason followed suit, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Daniel's unwavering gaze. Only Kyle remained rooted in place, refusing to back down even as doubt crept into his mind. "What are you gonna do?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "You think you're tough? Show me." Without hesitation, Daniel moved forward, closing the distance between them in seconds. Before Kyle could react, Daniel grabbed the baseball bat from Matt's hands, twisting it effortlessly out of his grip. Matt stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet in shock. Meanwhile, Jason dropped the trash can lids and bolted, disappearing into the shadows without looking back. Kyle stared at Daniel, his confidence wavering. You shouldn't have done that," he stammered, his bravado fading fast. "People are going to see this. They'll call the cops." Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying Kyle as if he were a bug under a microscope. "Go ahead," he said calmly. "Call them. Tell them how you've been terrorizing my family for days. Let's see what they have to say about that." For the first time, Kyle looked genuinely afraid. He glanced around, searching for some kind of escape route, but Daniel blocked his path. Realizing he was trapped, Kyle raised his hands defensively. Okay, I'm sorry. We didn't mean anything by it, we were just messing around." "Messing around?" Daniel repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Is that what you call vandalizing my property? Threatening my family? Hanging a noose in my yard?" Kyle swallowed hard, sweat trickling down his forehead. I didn't know it was such a big deal. Honest." "It's a big deal because it's hate," Daniel shot back, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "And now you're going to learn exactly what happens when you provoke someone who isn't afraid to stand up for himself." With that, Daniel acted. In one swift motion, he pinned Kyle to the ground, holding him firmly in place without applying too much pressure. Though Kyle struggled, thrashing wildly in an attempt to break free, He was no match for Daniel's enhanced strength. Within moments, he lay still, gasping for breath as reality sank in. Matt, who had been hovering nervously nearby, took off running the second he saw Kyle go down. Daniel didn't bother chasing him. Instead, he turned his attention back to Kyle, whose arrogance had vanished completely. Tears streamed down Kyle's face as he begged for mercy, his earlier bravado replaced by sheer terror. "I'm sorry," Kyle sobbed, his voice trembling. "Please, I won't do it again, I swear." Daniel stared at him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch taut between them. Finally, he released Kyle, stepping back to give him space. "Get out of here," he said quietly, "and if I ever see you near my house again, I won't be so forgiving." Kyle scrambled to his feet, nodding frantically as he backed away. Without another word, he turned and fled, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps on the pavement. As the chaos subsided, Daniel stood alone in the middle of the street, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Neighbors began, emerging from their homes, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. Some clapped quietly, offering silent support, while others retreated indoors, unsure of what to make of what they had witnessed. Back on the porch, Lisa watched everything unfold, her heart pounding in her chest. When Daniel returned to her side, she wrapped her arms around him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He nodded, pulling her close. "Yeah," he murmured. "But this isn't over yet." Not completely. Though Kyle and his gang had been humiliated, Daniel knew the real battle was far from finished. The hatred that fueled their actions ran deep, rooted in ignorance and prejudice that couldn't be erased overnight. Still, for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that change was possible even in the darkest corners of the world. As the night settled in, casting the neighborhood in shadow, Daniel resolved to use this moment as a turning point, not just for himself but for everyone who had suffered silently under the weight of injustice. Because sometimes standing up for yourself wasn't just about protecting your own, it was about showing others that they weren't alone. The days after the confrontation brought a strange sense of calm to the neighborhood. Word spread quickly about what had happened between Daniel and Kyle's gang. Some people whispered about how Daniel had put those troublemakers in their place, while others wondered if he had gone too far. But no matter where you stood, one thing was undeniable. Something had shifted. The balance of power in the community had tilted ever so slightly toward justice. For Daniel, the victory felt hollow. Yes, he had defended himself and his family, but it didn't erase the pain or fear they had endured. It didn't undo the damage caused by years of prejudice that lingered beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic suburb. As he sat on the porch late one evening watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, he realized that standing up to Kyle wasn't enough. If anything, it was just the beginning. Lisa joined him after a while, sitting quietly beside him as she often did when he needed to think. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. "I'm thinking about what comes next," he replied, his voice thoughtful. "This isn't over. Not really. We stopped Kyle and his friends, but we haven't fixed the problem. Not completely." She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "So, what do you want to do?" Daniel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I want to help people understand. To show them why this kind of hatred hurts not just me but everyone. Maybe I can start by talking to our neighbors, sharing my story, showing them that we're not so different after all." Lisa smiled, her eyes lighting up with pride. "That's a good idea, and I'll be right there with you every step of the way." With Lisa's support, Daniel began reaching out to the community. He started small, inviting neighbors over for coffee and casual conversations. At first, only a few showed up, those who had already been friendly or sympathetic, but gradually more people came. They listened as Daniel shared his experiences, not just as a victim of racism, but as someone who had worked hard to build a better life for his family. He spoke honestly about the challenges he had faced and the fears he still carried, but also about the hope he held for the future. To his surprise, Many of his neighbors admitted they had noticed the tension brewing, but hadn't known how to address it. Some confessed feeling powerless to intervene, while others admitted they hadn't fully understood the impact of their silence. Daniel encouraged them to speak up, to stand together against hate rather than letting it divide them. Meanwhile, Kyle struggled to process what had happened. For days he avoided leaving his house, too ashamed to face anyone. When Amber confronted him about it, he snapped defensively at first, insisting he hadn't done anything wrong. But as she pressed him, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions, cracks began to form in his armor. "You scared him, Kyle," Amber said firmly, her voice tinged with disappointment. "You scared his kids, his wife, his whole family. Do you even realize how much harm you caused?" Kyle opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, unable to deny the truth of her words. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what it must have been like for Daniel, to live under the constant threat of harassment, to feel unsafe in your own home. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him shaken. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even if I wanted to apologize, I doubt he'd listen." Amber placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a rare moment of tenderness. "Then start somewhere else. There are organizations working to fight racism and promote understanding. Maybe you could volunteer, learn more about why this matters." Though hesitant at first, Kyle followed her advice. He reached out to local groups focused on racial reconciliation and education, attending meetings and workshops designed to foster empathy and understanding. It wasn't easy. Many participants eyed him warily, unsure whether his intentions were genuine, but he persisted, determined to make amends for his past mistakes. As weeks turned into months, the neighborhood began to change. Neighbors, who had once ignored each other, struck up conversations. Parents organized playdates for their children, fostering friendships across racial lines. Even Kyle found ways to contribute, volunteering at community events and helping clean up public spaces. Though trust took time to rebuild, the seeds of unity had been planted. One sunny afternoon, the Carters hosted a gathering at their home, inviting everyone in the neighborhood to join them. The backyard buzzed with laughter and conversation as families mingled freely, sharing food and stories. Daniel stood near the grill, flipping burgers with a smile, while Lisa played games with Mia and Ethan on the lawn. Nearby, Kyle sat awkwardly on a folding chair, sipping lemonade and glancing around nervously. When Daniel noticed him, he walked over and extended a hand. "Thanks for coming," he said simply, his tone neutral but sincere. Kyle hesitated before shaking it, his grip firm despite his unease. "Thank you for letting me," he replied. "And I'm sorry for everything." Daniel nodded, accepting the apology without fanfare. "Apologies are a start," he said, "but actions matter more. Keep doing what you're doing, and we'll get through this together." As the day wore on, the atmosphere grew lighter, filled with moments of connection and healing. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like a true community, a place where differences were celebrated rather than feared. That night, as Daniel and Lisa tucked the kids into bed, they reflected on everything that had transpired. "Do you think things will stay this way?" Lisa asked, her voice tinged with cautious optimism. "I hope so," Daniel replied, pulling her close. "But even if they don't, we've shown them that change is possible, that hate doesn't have to win." Together they stood at the window, gazing out at the quiet street below. The tree in their front yard swayed gently in the breeze, its branches now free of any remnants of hatred. In its place hung a simple wooden sign, painted with bold letters, "Welcome." It was a reminder, not just to themselves but to everyone who passed by, that love, understanding, and resilience could overcome even the darkest storms. And though the journey ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, they faced it with hope, knowing they weren't alone.